Good morning. Hopefully, you are anticipating this Sunday. We're going to kind of work through just some basics on what we're going to be covering in our morning worship, but then again for our small group time. So for this Sunday, we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. If you remember from last week, really, last week's passage was an introduction all the way through at least the end of chapter 3, and very likely, it seems, even into chapter 4. And so this is just flowing from Peter's pastoral heart. He's told them, hey, you need to realize who you are. Remember who you are. You are sojourners, you're exiles. You need to run from your natural desires. You need to renew your affection and your obedience to Christ. And then you rejoice in what God is going to do in and through your sacrificial acts of service. And so what he does is he then moves into this next section that really isn't a new section, but just a section of follow-up material on what this practically looks like. What does it look like for us to run from our natural desires and run to Christ? And so he begins by saying, hey, one of the ways that this is going to look in your life is how you relate to government and how you relate to others. And so let me read the text for you. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using your liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. All right. So that's the text. And I've at least temporarily titled the message, Silence the Ignorant. All right. And I think that really does pick up on the big idea of the text and the purpose. The purpose of your obedience is to honor the will of God, for God, to silence the ignorant, so that they realize who you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that they grow in their affection and their desire to know more about who God is. All right. So as he develops this idea, he highlights the importance of realizing that when you submit to kings, you're not ultimately submitting to kings. Isn't that interesting, right? He tells us, hey, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. But why do we do that? Because it's for the Lord's sake, and this is the will of God. It is the will of God that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So ultimately you're submitting yourself to God. And so as you work through this, I think it'd be helpful for you to think through just ways in which people have failed to do that, all right? So that they identify, hey, this is something that I struggle with. I struggle with living for God's glory. And then from there, I think it's appropriate for us to even take time to rejoice in and to think through just how God has used government recently in our nation. So on a state level, local level, and then on a national level, how is God using our government to accomplish what he's supposed to? I think all too often we focus too much on the negative side. Even in what we're going to rejoice over, I think a lot of that is actually rejoicing in government's use of punishment. One of the areas where we should probably see growth in our government and how they exercise their responsibility is by praising those who do well, right? We should be more quick to praise as well people who do good, but our government doesn't honor that as much as they probably should. Talking through and thinking through, what does it mean to be a fool biblically? How does that imply and flow through into this idea of ignorance in the text? We're silencing the ignorant. Why are they ignorant? And how might we help them to bridge that information gap? And I think one of the things that Peter is saying is, you are the means by which that information gap is bridged. A biblical fool is a fool because they've denied God. They've denied his word. And so one of the ways that you and I are responsible for bridging that gap is by modeling Christ's likeness, so that as they see us, they're like, oh, that's different. Why are they living that different life? And then we serve as God's slaves. And so reminding ourselves that we are God's slaves. And the big idea really here is hones in on verse 7, verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And so it's built as a chiasm with honor on both sides, honoring all people, honoring the king, loving the brotherhood. So that's a higher tier. Our responsibility to the brothers in Christ is a higher tier. And then our responsibility to God is on an even higher tier. Fear God. And then he brings us back to reality, right? He tells us at the beginning, submit to God, or submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, right? But that submission to the government and the honoring of the government is really no different than our responsibility to every person else, because our primary focus is fearing God and honoring God. And so I really think that the podcast from the Thinklings, it starts at minute 10 minutes and 6 seconds in, where they start actually talking about the fear of God, will be very helpful if you haven't listened to that in the past, as you think through what that all means. I've listened to it a number of times and just went back and re-listened to it kind of while I was formatting stuff for small groups, and once again found it very helpful. So anyways, we will see you on Sunday, Lord willing.